What follows is an analysis of Halloween from 1978. If you've not seen it, then what the hell are you doing here? Bookmark the video, go watch it, then come back. This video will spoil the whole film since I'll be going into detail practically scene for scene, so massive spoilers, you have been warned. Film producer Erwin Yablans, on a flight from a festival in Milan, conceived an idea for a story about a serial killer who stalks babysitters. He pitched what was called the Babysitter Murders over the phone to John Carpenter when he landed. Carpenter and his then girlfriend Deborah Hill would develop a script based on that idea. They knew they had very little money to work with, but as demonstrated here, that can sometimes be a godsend when it comes to making films. It forces the filmmaker to think more creatively than they would have had they the budget to put whatever they wanted on screen. The film would feature a murder in the opening scene, then the next murder would not take place until the 54th minute in a 90-minute film. Now, fans of modern slasher films might say that nothing happens for most of the film, but actually, plenty happens. Let us start by taking a look at just what happens during the 47 minutes between the opening scene and Annie Wilkes' murder. We are first introduced to the concept of Michael Myers in an exposition dump between his doctor and a nurse who are on their way to Smith's Grove Sanatorium to transport him to some commitment hearing. Both Halloween 4 and Halloween 2018 would later include a transfer of Michael, which, by amazing coincidence, would take place the night before Halloween. Both films missed the point of the transfer scene in the original film. It was only to function as an exposition dump. The transfer didn't even happen. Michael Myers had escaped the sanatorium before they arrived. He would frighten the life out of the nurse and steal a car, but at no time show his face. Not showing the killer's face is an extension of not showing the monster. We are much more frightened of what we don't see than what we do, after all. It's like not showing the shark in Jaws, which I will soon be making a similar video to this about. After this scene, Michael would wear a mask throughout most of the film, but it might surprise you to hear that that wasn't the original intention. While hiding his face was always the intention, I picked up when reading the screenplay that the mask isn't described until Annie Wilkes' murder. In fact, here's how this scene reads. Behind the station wagon stands the shape of a man. We can't quite see his features from here, but it is clear that he is looking in the school window. The idea to set the film on Halloween night and thus call it Halloween was also the idea of Erwin Yablans after he discovered that, quite unbelievably, no film had ever been made with that title. Setting the film on Halloween meant our stalker could walk around in a mask in daylight and not draw too much attention. So this decision likely happened after the first draft of the screenplay was written, and chances are that the decision to show the mask as often as it is shown didn't happen until someone spray painted and cut the eye holes bigger in a Captain Kirk mask. Only upon seeing that pale, featureless, haunting face would anyone realise that it made the film scarier to show it. After Michael escapes the sanatorium, we are introduced to our protagonist. Carrying school books and dutiful to her father, she is dressed rather formally for a girl her age in 1978. The next shot shows great economy in writing. We learn our protagonist's name, and we get just from Tommy's reaction to her that she is a likeable character. Not only is she a babysitter, she must be a very good babysitter if Tommy's enthusiasm is anything to go by. Personally, I never liked any babysitter I had as a child. To me anyway, Laurie comes across as a rare breed. The most common mistake of most slasher films, in my opinion, is that the viewer doesn't care very much about the protagonist. Their characters are cardboard cutouts that aren't well established or are indistinguishable from their friends. If you want the viewer to be truly tense when a killer is chasing your protagonist in the climax, you need to set up the characters properly. As this scene shows, that doesn't necessarily take a lot of screen time. In a later scene, we will be introduced to Laurie's friends, Linda and Annie. The contrast between these characters is what further informs us about Laurie. The first friend introduced is Linda. The script reading, Linda is a knockout. In tight jeans and tight t-shirt, she carries no books. How Linda is dressed and that she carries no books are telling details. They only serve that function, however, in comparison to Laurie, who does carry books. Laurie, 17 and pretty in a quiet sort of way, her face has a soft, innocent quality, her eyes bright and alive. These are the words that introduce Laurie. No focus on what she's wearing, you might notice. Interestingly, Annie isn't described in the script at all, as though they weren't sure how she might dress or what she might be carrying. Annie is distinguishable from Laurie though, as both Linda and Annie seem preoccupied with talking about their respective boyfriends. That Laurie doesn't join the conversation too much that she has nothing to do while Linda has to get ready for a dance, tells us she is single. She even tells us that
guys think I'm too smart.
At the end of this scene in the screenplay, there is reference to an angle on Laurie's notebook where she ascribed the words, "Laurie Strode is lonely." While that would have been most endearing and point to her being quite a self-aware character, of course it would have been superfluous. Show, don't tell is a rule that applies in writing generally, not just to film. That shot would have told us something we would soon find out anyway, so it rightly ended up on a cutting room floor, if it was even shot. Laurie being single and not being preoccupied with boys actually serves the credibility of her survival through the film. Most, if not all, slasher films would apply this model in the decades to come, thus the virgin survivor became a trope. Far from being a moral judgment that promiscuity leads to death, it was actually just John Carpenter and Deborah Hill's method for making Laurie's survival credible in the climax of Halloween. The idea that you can never have sex in a slasher film and you die is a misinterpretation led by the constant reuse of an idea that Carpenter and or Hill came up with while writing this film. Once again, it was for credibility. What do I mean by credibility though? These days, people often use the words credible and possible synonymously. According to the Oxford Dictionary, possible means able to be done or achieved. It is a word that directly relates to the real world. Much that happens in a film is not possible in reality, we know that. Yet often I hear people scoff and say as if while watching a film. Credible is defined as able to be believed. That is all the events in a film need to be. In a story world you have created, with the viewer or reader suspending disbelief, the events must seem believable in the context of that story world. Possible is not the bar fiction reaches for, just credible. And a success or failure of that depends on how well you stick to the rules of the fictional world you've created. Remember that for later. While we are being introduced to Laurie and the two of the girls, or rather parallel to it, Dr. Sam Loomis's function is to build the threat in our minds. He tells the police that Myers is on his way in this scene. Actually, in the script, he is speaking to a family member on the phone. I suppose they felt when writing that setting Loomis up as a family man would make us care about him more. It was actually Donald Pleasance who objected to that idea. Whether it was just artistic instinct or not, that makes absolute sense in a writer's mind. We don't have to care about Loomis, since Loomis is never pursued by Myers. Well, until a sequel anyway. And at this stage, there were no plans to ever make a sequel. Hard to believe today, I know. So from the off, Dr. Loomis is obviously terrified about Michael's intentions when he reaches Haddonfield. Juxtaposed with this, the next scene will show Laurie and her friends being stalked by Myers, raising our anxiety levels. It's worth mentioning here that John Carpenter shot this film with anamorphic lenses, creating this 2.39 to 1 ratio. That wasn't typical in low-budget cinema at the time. This ratio was usually reserved for epic films or sci-fi films. What it did for this film, where you have a stalker who could appear from anywhere, was make the viewer feel more exposed. We search the frame constantly with our eyes when Myers isn't even in a shot, wondering where he might appear from next. When Laurie gets home, looking from her bedroom window, she sees Myers in a neighbour's yard. It was only when I read the script that it became obvious what the intention was with this shot. I'd always thought it rather strange that Myers disappears while Laurie was looking at him, that she doesn't look away, then look back like she did in the classroom. The sheets continue to twist and turn in the wind, but now the shape is gone. The idea seems to have been that the sheets would cover his disappearance. A fine idea, but at the angle of the shot, those sheets would have needed to be impractically high and longer to achieve that. So why not have Laurie look away and back then? It may just be that Laurie in the bedroom was shot before the shot of Myers. Frankly though, her looking away and back would have seemed so out of place given how much more anxious she is now than she was when she was in the classroom. Upon reflection, despite the impracticality of Myers disappearing while Laurie is looking at him, the scene still works, adding to the idea of Laurie questioning her own perception. The plot threads of Laurie and Dr. Loomis come closest to intersect prior to the climax in a scene at the hardware store. I particularly love this shot. How Loomis walks up, has a conversation with the sheriff, and how we see the vehicle in the background, with Loomis just missing it. It's all one shot. This is very reminiscent of Hitchcock for me, how he would sometimes create suspense just by leaving the camera in one spot and letting the action just happen. There are a number of shots like this in Halloween, some of which I'll mention later. When Laurie and Annie finish their car journey, the geography is clearly established from the point of view of Michael Myers. He watches Laurie enter this house and Annie enter the house across the street. Most of the rest of the film will take place in or between these two houses. Geography is of paramount importance, particularly when it comes to horror. We, the audience, need to understand the layout of events, what happens where, and especially where our protagonist is going when she's running away. The only horror film that springs to mind at the moment that fails to establish the geography is Alien 3. In this scene, the alien chases people through a labyrinth of corridors, but since we are unfamiliar with the layout of the labyrinth, all attention is lost. We have no idea where the safe area is, where the pursued are trying to escape to, and the filmmakers seem to be relying on the proximity of the alien to be the tension builder here. That's not enough. We need to understand where they're going, the escape route. By contrast, Halloween takes simple steps to establish the geography for the chase scenes we will experience later. Next, the sheriff and Dr. Loomis arrive at the Myers house. After discovering the remains of a half-eaten dog to further the inhumanity of Myers in our minds, Loomis is frightened by a broken piece of gutter that smashes through the window. In the script, this was actually set up in a scene earlier. A broken rusted rain gutter clangs back and forth against the house in the wind. It's included in the arrival at the house scene. Since the scene was all one shot, there was no close-up of that clanging gutter to set that up. Even if it had been set up though, there isn't really an explanation for why the gutter chose to come through the window during a visit, when it could have happened any time. The function of this startling moment, aside from scaring the pants off us, was to both demonstrate the level of fear the Doctor feels, and to set up the gun he carries, which will prove useful later. The Doctor further expresses his fear by outlining the history of Michael Myers' treatment in a haunting speech delivered brilliantly by Donald Pleasance. The very idea that we have a psychiatrist of all people classifying Myers as pure evil takes the statements to another level. Before psychiatry existed, you see, humans believed that anyone who acted strangely or who did terrible things may have been possessed by evil spirits. So for a psychiatrist to say someone is simply evil more so implies that it must be true. Now, having had the life scared out of us by Loomis, we are soon back to Myers stalking Annie. Intercut with his looming presence outside the house is Tommy's point of view of the shape who once again is there, then disappears, throwing doubt upon a child's perception. Throughout the film, the perception of various characters is thrown into doubt. Laurie doubted herself earlier when she thought she was being stalked. The sheriff doubts the seriousness of the situation as expressed by Dr. Loomis, and what Tommy sees but nobody else does is dismissed as a child's imagination. This is all necessary, of course, because if everybody had been believed, then the necessary actions may have been taken to avoid the murders that would follow. Moreover, though, the fact that the film is set on Halloween, when American children and teenagers traditionally play pranks, means that characters are likely to misinterpret even dangerous situations as pranks. This will happen a few times later in the film. In the next scene, Annie goes to the outhouse in order to wash her clothes. Myers appears in the background twice, but is not seen by Annie. All the while we, the viewers, are bracing ourselves behind a pillow, waiting for him to pounce on her. And yet, it doesn't happen. After that scene, the build-up to Annie's death is effortless. They don't even have to have Myers in the frame. Annie goes out to the car, finds it's locked, returns to the house and brushes her hair before returning to the garage. These are quite simple actions, but all the while we're anxiously scanning the frame, wondering where he might be. We know he's going to strike. He's killed 2 people already in this film, and Loomis has been warning us how evil he is through most of the film to this point. The only question is when and where it might happen. The film lingers on that question brilliantly, raising our tension levels near to the point of explosion. When Annie returns to the car, not noticing that the door is unlocked, she runs her fingers over the steam on a windscreen. The script doesn't have this. It reads, Annie slides in and inserts the key in the ignition. The car starts. Annie glances at the car door lock. Suddenly, she remembers it was locked. She stares at it, puzzled. To shoot a scene like this would have meant cutting to a close-up of Annie reacting while looking back at the car door. Instead, by adding the steam on a window, they can hold on a one-shot, making Myers' appearance in the backseat more startling than if they had cut around the scene. Plus, how do you really show that Annie remembers that the door was locked? Now, remember I said something does happen in the 47 minutes between the first and second on-screen murder? It does. We just covered it. The characters are set up, the threat is built, and suspense is built. That's what happens, and it's usually 1, 2, or 3 of these things that are sadly missing from a lot of horror movies today, not just slasher films. Something that always seems to be present in modern horror films is startle music, whenever there is a scare. It is used in Halloween, but only when there is something to genuinely be afraid of, i.e. when Myers is present. There are 3 jump scares in Halloween that do not have Myers in, and they don't have startle music either. One is here, one is here, and the other is here.
Oh, frick.
If you've seen Jaws, you may remember this scene. Every scene in Jaws when a shark approaches includes this music. This scene has no music, because there is no true threat, it's just a couple of kids with a cardboard fin. So Linda and Bob arrive at the house where Annie is babysitting. Now I've often defended this dialogue exchange where people react to the line,
"Then you rip my clothes off, then we rip Lindsay's clothes off."
"This is Lindsay." I've always said that it was obviously a case of the actor fluffing his lines. Imagine my surprise to discover that that was how the line was written in the script. My apologies to the actor. You didn't fluff your line. I can only presume it was an error on the part of either Carpenter or Hill. Surely they meant to write, "Then we rip Annie's clothes off." After Linda and Bob have the, second quickie that's been featured in this film, Bob goes down to the kitchen. This is another one of those long-held, unbroken shots I was talking about earlier. We scan the dark room filled with spots of light, for the spot of light we might recognise as the mask of Myers. When he investigates a noise, even though we can hear Myers breathing, so we know he's there, we are still startled when he finally appears because of the number of times we've been anxious he's going to jump out and he hasn't before that. We don't trust our own anxious feelings due to the way we've been taught not to trust him through all this build-up. This is the only reason this works as a jump scare. It should have been obvious, and it would have been had we not been misled to believe that his appearance wouldn't be so obvious. As I mentioned earlier, the fact that the film is set on Halloween leads many characters to misinterpret dangerous situations as benign. And when Myers appears at the door to Linda in a sheet wearing Bob's glasses, that is the clearest example of this. She reacts as though it is Bob, trying to play a trick on her, gets bored and decides to ignore him and phone Laurie. Again, we just hold on a shot of Linda as Myers approaches, witnessing her indifferent expression while her murderer moves slowly forwards to kill her. One thing that this film holds, above every other film I've seen from the franchise, is the lighting of the mask. In the sequels, the lighting became increasingly flat, often the eyes are lit. This shot demonstrates how much more frightening it is to not show the eyes. With no eyes, he is soulless, like a skull. We return to Laurie while she climbs the stairs to check on the kids. Aside from being a calm beat in the emotional juxtaposition of the film, this scene establishes the upstairs geography, which will be important for the climax. Next, Laurie crosses the street towards the house where Annie was babysitting. We know 3 murders have occurred there, so of course we're going to feel anxious for Laurie. The scene is very reminiscent of this scene from Psycho. In fact, it's almost shot for shot. If you want to build suspense, you can't go wrong borrowing from the master of suspense, Alfred Hitchcock. Upon entering the house, Laurie doesn't turn on any lights. This is something of a horror cliche. I even think it was a cliche before this film. Obviously, the filmmakers are trying to scare the audience and more light would reduce the tension. Today, I would recommend having the killer turn off the electricity and have the protagonist try the lights to disguise the cliche. Of course, even Laurie falls for the idea that her friends are playing a trick on her. Again, it's Halloween, so perfectly understandable. Then, with we, the audience, filling with dread, she climbs the stairs and approaches the bedroom.
Okay, gotta pause. I gotta pause for a second. Okay. Just needed to get back to reality for a second.
After finding the bodies of her 3 friends, she stands beside a black doorway. Jamie Lee Curtis does her best to sell the idea that this action is due to her stress of the situation, while we're all thinking we'd have been sprinting down the stairs to the front door. Of course, the real reason was so that we could have this shot, where they raise the light on a mask of Michael Myers.
Oh my gosh!
It is almost as if our eyes have suddenly begun to adjust to the darkness, the script says. Conceptually, the shot is so brilliant they would repeat it in Halloween 2. Of course, it would be less effective because we didn't know the nurse in the shot half as well as we knew Laurie. We cared less about the character, so weren't as anxious about their fate. After Myers finally attacks is this cost-cutting POV shot of Laurie falling down to the stairs. If you look at the credits, there was actually only one stunt itemised, and that was Michael Myers falling from the balcony. So if you don't have the money to invest in another stunt, the POV falling shot is probably your best option. What follows is a classic chase scene, building tension by skillfully cutting between a pursuer and a pursued. Laurie reaches the back door and is jammed by a rake. Here is where Laurie is often perceived as a little slow, since it seems to take ages for it to occur to her to break the glass of the window to remove the rake. In Laurie's defense, I must say it's not her fault. It's the editor and director who are to blame for this impression. In the interests of building tension, of course, the editor holds back on Laurie resolving the obstacle for as long as possible. They want the audience jumping up and down, screaming at the screen. Now, the reason I blame the director also is that Carpenter could have given her more to do during this scene rather than just jiggling a door that isn't budging. What if the rake wasn't there? What if the door was just locked? In the script it was locked and she escaped by a window. What if Laurie spots a bunch of keys on a kitchen counter and is desperately trying to find the right key while Michael's busting through the door? Finally, she panics and decides to throw a chair through the window. She would have maintained her agency. Laurie's attempt to get help from the neighbours once she's escaped the house and her subsequent run across the street were once again all taken in a single shot. It wasn't described in the script that way. In the script there is a description of an old woman in a nightgown who approaches the door. As written, it would have required several shots to show. Now, I'm not sure what influence it was to the filmmakers that they were using one of those newfangled steady cams, but it is worth mentioning that Halloween was shot in 20 to 22 days depending on which source you're reading. You might ask exactly how they achieved this. The answer is probably the Steadicam. The earliest use in film of a Steadicam was for a film called Bound for Glory in 1976. Some of you may have heard it was first used in the film Rocky the same year. In fact, the Steadicam was used in 2 films before it was used in Rocky, Bound for Glory and Marathon Man. Now, the great thing about a Steadicam is that you don't have to waste time rigging a camera between shots. You can cut, ask the operator to stand in a different position, change whatever small detail might need changing, and roll again. So long as your operator has plenty of stamina, you can get through a lot more shots in a short amount of time than you'd be able to with traditional camera rigging. Back to cross-cutting between pursuer and pursued. In the script for this scene, it says that Laurie drops her keys and ends up losing them down a crack in the porch. If she had have done that, then this scene would have required more cuts to close-ups, effectively breaking up this scene further from its real focus, which is Myers pursuing Laurie and Laurie trying to escape. Most of this scene is literally cutting back and forth between 2 shots. It's the cinematic equivalent of looking over your shoulder every couple of seconds to check if you're still being chased and how close the chaser is. So following Laurie's entry of the house, she checks quickly to see if the phone lines are cut, which they should be since that was a necessary trope even in 1978. Today, you need to go even further than this because a phone line is no longer required. You need to put your characters in the middle of nowhere with no signal, or have the charge run out on a cell phone, or set your film before cell phones were even a thing. Laurie then discovers that the window is open and we hear the breathing. So we know Myers is in the room. It might be just a little silly here, since there is only one place Myers could possibly be out of sight in this room, and Laurie turns her back on the sofa. However, that's not what most people complain about in this scene. After Laurie stabs Myers in the neck with a knitting needle, and Myers falls to the floor where he is immobile, Laurie does the thing that everybody says they wouldn't do. She throws away the knife. Jamie Lee Curtis has stated that this shot showed her the power of a close-up. There was no close-up here, so most of us missed the disgusted expression on her face the moment before she throws down the knife. Revulsion at the sight of her friend's blood on the knife might have seemed more reasonable. I'd say in 1978 they could have ended the film here. Dissolved the flashing lights outside the house, Laurie gets wheeled out to an ambulance. As she pulls away, Loomis is standing watching Myers being zipped up in a body bag. He gives a concluding speech to the sheriff. As they walk away, the camera cranes up to show the full street of concerned neighbours, fade to black and roll credits. Now, we all know this isn't how it ended, and actually my biggest criticism of the film is here. You see, I first encountered Michael Myers as a child when a family member rented the video Halloween 2. Halloween 2 starts by replaying the end of the first film. In the opening scene of Halloween 2, Michael Myers survived being shot and falling off a balcony totally illogically. But remember, this was the opening scene of the film, the setup. If you see the second film first, you honestly don't question Myers' survival through the rest of the film. Remember what I said earlier about setting up your story world? In the world of Halloween 2, Michael Myers can survive where other men would die. That's set up in the very first scene of Halloween 2, which is of course the end of the first film. My main criticism of Halloween is that they did not set it up. didn't even hint at Michael's survival before he started surviving. There was not even the suggestion that Myers was invincible, and they could so easily have suggested it. Loomis could have told the sheriff about a fire in a wing of Smith's Grove where patients on that wing were suffocated by smoke. 11 patients died. Incredibly though, Myers was somehow the only survivor and was found in perfect health. There, I just did it. Laid the seed. You're welcome. I only recently came to understand that Carpenter and Hill effectively broke the rules of their story world. I think due to the fact that I saw the films in the wrong order. It could have so easily been avoided. Even this scene in The Lost World, as scruffy as it is set up, and as absurd as it is, was still hinted at earlier in the film. Anyway, easy to say in hindsight, I guess. So, after it turns out Myers is still alive, Laurie locks the kids in a closet, races through to the bedroom, opens the window doors, and hides in another closet. Frankly, Myers gives her way too much time to do this, but who's counting? I've heard people asking why she doesn't escape through the window and leave the children in the house with Myers. That would be entirely against the caring character she has been set up as. I support every decision she makes here. After she stabs Myers for the second time though, she does do a couple of silly things. First of all, and there's no excuses this time, she throws away the knife. I suppose it's possible that she was more certain he was dead, less certain she was on target with the previous stabbing. But then, after sending the kids to get help, she leans against the door frame with her back to Myers. Now, don't get me wrong, I recognise what a brilliant shot this is with Myers out of focus in the negative space behind Laurie's head. The question is, given what we know about Laurie, would she do this? The only excuse I can give here is that she is injured, tired and traumatised. I often wondered if this might have seemed more credible if she had at least not thrown a knife away. My suggestion being, what if she still had the knife while sat on the floor? Maybe she looks back at Myers' body, watches it for a few moments, gripping the knife intently, finally relaxes her grip, accepts he's dead, then turns away and leans her head against the doorframe. Then we have Myers sit up. That would have taken longer but would have seemed a bit more credible. Also, would have been a great reason for her to stay with the body, to make sure the kids get away. I also don't agree with the choice of revealing the face of Michael Myers, however momentarily. This wasn't Nick Castle anyway, who played Myers through most of the movie, except this shot, when it was Deborah Hill. The point is, though, that they did such a fantastic job building the mystique of Michael Myers, making him a soulless, evil entity. To reveal he even has a human face under there kind of betrays a lot of effort. At the start of Halloween 2, they would wisely cut that shot out for the same reasons. Anyway, Myers is shot 6 times, falls off a balcony before a pause in the action. When Loomis looks over the balcony, he's gone. At the end of the screenplay, the backyard, the neighbouring yards, the street are all empty, quiet, dark. There is only the sound of the wind swelling in the trees. The idea to cut between shots of every location around a town obviously came in the edit suite, since the footage used is taken from exactly the same position as shots we've seen earlier. When you direct, you see, there's usually about 5 seconds between when you shout rolling and when you shout action, as well as a few seconds at the end of the action before you shout cut. This creates editing space, just in case you need a little more footage this way or that way when you're editing. Here, they've used this footage brilliantly, cutting between every location and adding the ever-loudening breathing of Myers, leaving the audience with the impression that he could be anywhere. A scary notion to go home with. Now you may ask why I haven't gone into the opening scene. Well, they shot it last, so I thought I'd tackle it last. They filmed it last, of course, because the Myers house was actually how it looked in every scene in the film after this scene. It needed to be fixed up and painted, which I understand the cast and crew participated in. That's true indie filmmaking for you folks. So the opening scene in the script has POV in just about every paragraph, although interestingly describes things that Myers could only see if the bedroom in question was on the ground floor. Since there is also no mention of the stairs, I think we can safely assume that was the original intention. The first film to ever put us in the point of view of the killer was Michael Powell's Peeping Tom, a film so far ahead of its time that it was detested by critics in 1960. When we watch the murder through the killer's eyes, we feel like screaming at the screen's warn the intended victim. But we are powerless, propelled unwillingly by the whim of the assassin whose eyes we're passengers of. This shot is one long continuous 4-minute shot, actually broken by 2 disguised cuts. The longest portion is 3 minutes long, going from the front of the house, round the rear, through the kitchen, up the stairs to the mask on the floor. Now, any die-hard Hitchcock fan might scoff and say that 3 minutes is nothing. Hitchcock's Rope consisted of a number of 10-minute takes. I myself have a 2-minute shot in a short film I made a few years ago, and it was quite complex, over-ambitious you might say. We spent half a day filming on that one shot. It took us 4 hours to get it right. And even then, 2 different takes had to be spliced together via a disguised cut since we'd never got both ends of the shot entirely correct in one take. However, I would argue that the opening to Halloween was far more difficult to film than a 10-minute shot from Rope. First of all, they weren't on a soundstage, so lacked total control of their environment like Hitchcock had. Next, they didn't have enough lamps, so the lights had to be repositioned while the shot was in motion, before the camera entered the house. Also, not all the rooms were fixed up, so the camera operator, Ray Stella, had to be really careful about what was visible in the lens. He also had to squeeze himself through doorways and climb stairs, and cameras were not light at the time. All those challenges made achieving those 3 minutes of continuous film a remarkable feat. Halloween was shot for $325,000 and made $70 million worldwide, making it the film with the highest cost-to-profit ratio of any film before The Blair Witch Project was released some 21 years later. It would spawn more sequels than I could care to count, although Halloween 2 from 1981 will always be the only official sequel in my mind. Halloween's influence would ripple through the next few decades of Hollywood film, establishing expectations for a subgenre that had actually been around for a long time, just with inconsistent ingredients. The film established a formula that worked every time, I'd say. While there were more successful and less successful slasher films in the decades to come, the low budget made them all successful. In fact, that's a great rule for Hollywood generally at the moment, particularly relevant in an age of inflated budgets, that you can't lose with a low budget. You could have great success with a low budget, but you can't lose. It's a pretty safe bet. As for the influence John Carpenter's Halloween had on me, it was quite pronounced. After deciding to become a filmmaker myself at the age of 12, some of the first short films I made in school were slasher films inspired by Halloween. Anyway, I hope this has been informative and made clear why I think Halloween is the most effective slasher film ever made. You may recognise Cassie from Popcorn in Bed peppered throughout the video to illustrate the emotions the filmmaker is trying to provoke. Out of all the YouTube reactors I watched, there was a reason I chose Cassie. Film is actually the art of emotional manipulation through audiovisual means. Having watched the film I'm talking about endlessly since childhood, studied them on an intellectual level, I can often forget how I first felt watching them. That's the great thing about reaction videos. That's the true purpose they serve. Feeding our need to feel the films we have numbed ourselves to through repeated viewing. Watching someone watch a film, empathising with them, puts us through those emotions we're looking to feel again. Now, people do sometimes react differently, it's true. Any number of factors can interfere with the reactor's reaction. Their experience, their upbringing, their education, their age, etc. We call these things intervening variables. The whole concept of marketing is based around the idea that different people like different things, which is why you must be careful to adhere to the wants of your target audience. I chose Cassie's reaction from Popcorn in Bed simply because her every reaction lines up perfectly with what I'm sure was the intention of the filmmakers. You can find a link to Popcorn in Bed in the description below. Cassie's videos are often my favourite reactions, and I am a Patreon, how do you say that? Patreon? I don't know. No doubt when I do the Jaws video, I will likely use Popcorn in Bed reactions, provided Cassie doesn't complain in the meantime. So go and check her channel out if you're a fan of movie reactions. Before I finish, I do want to talk about this crane shot, the young Michael Myers reveal. I couldn't work out how to make the point I had about it slot in neatly earlier. You see, a lot of reactors are astonished that the parents just stand there. Don't take the knife from the boy. Don't ask any question. The reason for that is that this is a dramatic hold. You're supposed to be so shocked that the killer is a little boy that you stare open-mouthed at the screen as the camera pulls away. That's why everyone is holding still, to burn the image in your mind. It's basically a pose. Do you get it? That's it from me for today. I'd love to hear your thoughts and feedback in the comments section. Also, your experience of first seeing Halloween. I'll be back with Jaws next, I think, and this will likely precede a number of other Spielberg films since he is my favourite filmmaker and has been since I was 6 years old. Subscribe if you're interested in this type of content. like the video, particularly if you've made it this far, because you wouldn't have watched this long if you weren't interested, obviously. Until next time, I can be reached on Twitter and Facebook, the links to which you'll find below. I've been Francis X Lord. Thank you for listening. Ciao for now.